Hello, my dear students. Today, we will talk about experiments of democracy in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. The focus of this lecture will be on the following objectives: to refresh ourselves with the definition of democracy and types of democracy, to understand the factors responsible that led to decline of democracy in Pakistan, to have an overview of Sri Lanka's experiments with democracy, to have comparative assessment of Sri Lanka's and Pakistan's democracy. So let's see first the definition of democracy. The term democracy is derived from two Greek words. Demos means people and kratos, rule, in the mid of 5th century BC, to denote the political system then existing in some Greek city-states, notably Athens. Literally means rule by the people. Thus, democracy is a form of government in which people have the authority to deliberate and decide legislation. In a democracy, people elect their representatives to govern themselves, or citizens govern themselves. Although it is believed that ancient Greece was the origin of this form of government, however, the notion of democracy basically stemmed after the Treaty of Westphalia 1648. Democracy became socially more favorable after the French Revolution in 1789, and thinkers like Rousseau also advocated and wrote about democracy as the justifiable form of government. On the other hand, monarchy and the supremacy of church were challenged and attracted widespread criticism. Since then, these ruthless forms of the government were started relocating with a democratic form of government in many countries of Europe and the West. Despite such a sparking entry in the system of the world's government system, the concept of democracy in Europe, especially after 1648, did not prevent the penetration of nationalism, thereby leading to the distortion of genuine concept of democracy. Therefore, until the mid-20th century, democracy did not have smooth sailing, partly because democracy had to compete with challenges of Nazism, fascism and totalitarianism till the end of Second World War. Eventually, after 1945, the norms of democracy became more famous and spread across the world. The word democracy derives from the Greek word demo, which means people. In this form of government, the supreme powers are vested in the people. Moreover, in large societies, democracy can be exercised by the people of that society and state directly, or it can be exercised through the elected representatives of the citizens. According to President Abraham Lincoln, democracy is the government of the people, by the people and for the people. Democracy is more than a just set of some government institutions. It depends on some well understood set of norms, values, mindset and practices. Cornerstones of democracy include freedom of assembly, association, property rights, freedom of religion, speech, inclusiveness, equality, citizenship, consent of government, voting rights, freedom from unwarranted governmental deprivation of the rights to life and liberty, and minority rights. Now, let's have a look on types of democracy. There are mainly two forms of democracy: direct and indirect, or representative democracy. Direct democracy is a political system where the citizens participate in the decision making personally, contrary to relying on intermediaries or representatives. A direct democracy gives the voting population the power to change constitutional laws, put forth initiatives, referendums and suggestions for laws, give binding orders to elected officials such as revoking them before the end of their elected term, or initiating a lawsuit for breaking a campaign promise. Direct democracy as a government system currently exists in Switzerland. Representative or indirect democracy involves election of government officials by the people being represented. If the head of the state is also democratically elected, then it's called democratic republic. The most common mechanism involves election of the candidate with a majority or a plurality of votes. Most Western countries have representative system. A characteristic of representative democracy is that while representatives are elected by people to act in people's interest, they retain the freedom to exercise their own judgment as how best to do so. However, some modern democracies that are predominantly representative in nature also heavily rely upon forms of political action that are directly democratic. These democracies, which combine elements of representative democracy and direct democracy, are termed hybrid democracies, semi-direct democracies, or participatory democracies. Examples include some United States states, where frequent use is made of referendum and initiatives. Students, now let's have the look on Pakistan and the notion of democracy. Pakistan's founder, Ali Muhammad Jinnah, believed that Islam taught us about the values of democracy such as equality, justice and tolerance almost 1400 years ago. Ali Muhammad Jinnah said, democracy is in the blood of Muslims who look upon complete equality of manhood and believe in fraternity and liberty. Brotherhood, equality and fraternity of man, these are all the basic points of our religion, culture and civilization, said Ali Muhammad Jinnah. Islam teaches its followers to be tolerant, kind and passionate. The tenets of Islam enjoin upon every Muslim to give protection to its neighbors and to the minorities regardless of caste and creed. Since independence, Pakistan has experienced different forms of the government, which include parliamentary, presidential system, martial law and democracy. Under the Constitution of 1956, Pakistan had experienced a parliamentary system, but within 2 years the Constitution was suspended and martial law had been imposed by General Ayub Khan in 1958. In 1962, Ayub Khan introduced presidential system under the Constitution of 1962, in which he launched the system of basic democracies in Pakistan. However, due to corruption, rigging in elections and nepotism, this system also could not succeed in Pakistan. After the martial law regime, the new civilian government introduced new constitution in 1973. Under the 1973 constitution, parliamentary form of government has been implemented again, with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was the premier of Pakistan at the time. However, this democratic process was again distorted by Zia-ul Haq, who imposed martial law in Pakistan in July 1977. Therefore, Pakistan again remained under the control of undemocratic government from 1977 to 1988. After the death of Zia-ul Haq, the election had been conducted in 1988 and Benazir Bhutto became the premier of Pakistan. However, in 1990s, the Pakistan People's Party government was suspended under the allegations of corruption and poor governance. From 1993 to 1996, PPP again remained as the ruling party, but could not complete its tenure and got dismissed due to corruption charges. On the other hand, Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz ruled from 1991 to 1993 and 1997 to 1999. Here again, the elected government of PMLN could not complete its tenure, and in October 1999, General Musharraf had imposed martial law in the country. The process of democracy was again and again derailed in Pakistan. However, President Musharraf had claimed that he will leave a sustainable democracy set up in Pakistan, which will stop military takeover in the future. He also claimed that his government will create enough job opportunities, human resources, elevate poverty, and will improve basic facilities of life. But he also did not fulfill all the promises. Moreover, before elections, almost all political leaders promised that they will work for the welfare of the country when they came into power. However, still, all governments could not cope with the basic issues of common citizens. Therefore, the general public is still suffering from basic facilities of life, food and water shortage, energy crisis and health facilities. The former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mian Nawaz Sharif, claimed that through our policies and hard work, we will make Pakistan a real welfare state. However, like the previous government, his government could not fulfill their promises. Despite the fact that almost all political parties struggled for the restoration of democracy whenever the country faced dictatorships. However, in Pakistan, the real democratic norms could not be prevailing due to many factors, such as clashes and conflicts between governments are very common in Pakistani politics. Therefore, contradictory and undemocratic behaviors of political elite are the major problem in the development of true democracy in Pakistan. From 1988 to 1999 and 2008 to 2013, PPP and PMLN have ruled. In May 2013 elections, PMLN made the government again. Though both parties under the leadership of Benazir Bhutto and Mian Nawaz Sharif had struggled for the restoration of democracy, both paid little attention to the rights of common public, especially the rights of minorities, basic facilities of life and rule of law. Consequently, both have encouraged undemocratic norms at the societal and political level. So in case of Pakistan, the real problem is not democratic form of government, but in the autocratic attitude of governments and the leaders. As mostly politicians does not bother about their promises when they come to power. Former Premier Nawaz Sharif also claimed his real purpose is the restoration of democracy, but his government could not address the issue of common citizens such as poverty, unemployment, energy crisis, etc. For the progress and development of democracy, the role of political parties is important. The political parties are a tool of mass mobilization and patronage in Pakistan. However, major challenge for political leadership is to alter the role of political parties to interest representation and advocacy in legislature. Unfortunately, the politicians adopt authoritarian policies and attitudes rather than encouraging and promoting democratic values, policies, behaviors, rule of law and tolerance for opposition parties. In November 1997, the supporters of PMLN attacked the premises of the Supreme Court of Pakistan, but the leadership did not discourage their supporters. Additionally, in a democracy, role of state is to protect the lives and assets of its citizens. In this regard, the role of the police and judiciary is also very important. However, all democratic governments fail to maintain peace and law and order in the country. Therefore, terrorism and extremism have been increased in Pakistan. Even many innocent citizens are dying in the targeted killings, and police fail to protect the citizens from such crimes. Though the government and Pakistan Army has initiated Operation Zarb-e-Azam to eliminate terrorist groups from Pakistan and getting triumph in this operation. As a result, the image of Pakistan in restoring at national and international levels. Also, free, fair and regular elections are real essence of true democracy. However, the record of Pakistan's elections in this regard is a bit poor. Therefore, after elections, all defeated parties blamed the winning side of allegedly rigging and terms of election unfair. Furthermore, the parties also manipulate election results when they came into government. It's hard for a party to get a clear majority due to multi-party system in Pakistan. As a result, mostly a coalition government has to be established and many parties remained in government despite fewer seats in elections. For instance, in May 2013 elections, PMLN got majority votes and Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf has emerged as a second majority party in the country. After 2013 elections, PTI chairman Imran Khan blamed the elections were rigged, thereby raising serious questions over the transparency in this vital political activity. Furthermore, in Pakistan, civil and military leaders have ruled. Despite the fact that almost all political leaders are in favor of democracy, they find little interest in the development and progress of genuine democratic norms and behaviors in this democratically deprived country. Political leaders come in public to get votes, but once they come to power, they try keeping themselves at distance from common citizens. Students, we will now look into the experiments of democracy in Sri Lanka. Democracy has been part of Sri Lankan politics since far as back as 1931 under the British colonial rule, when Sri Lanka enjoyed universal franchise and partial representation. Yet, despite 90 years of democratic resilience, Sri Lankan political system is somehow flawed, ill-reputed and often charged with being undemocratic. Through a democratic lens, the future of majority rule requires that decisions are made upon collective preference without marginalizing minorities. Although in Sri Lanka, majority rule is confused with majoritarianism. The latter grants higher status to majority decisions even if they may harm a minority. The essential democratic elements of consent consensus are the little concern to decision makers in Sri Lanka. Instead, since gaining independence in 1948, Sri Lankan political parties have continually adopted electoral strategies that appeal to the Sinhalese Buddhist majority. Ethnocentric policies such as the Ceylon Citizenship Act of 1948 that excluded estate Tamils from citizenship and later amended, which disfranchised them from the Sinhala only Act of 1956, which violated the language rights of the Tamils, and the Article 9 of 1978 Constitution, which gives Buddhism the foremost place in Sri Lanka, are all strategies by the successive governments to gain political leverage through majority popularity. On the one hand, the Constitution states that no citizen shall be discriminated against on the grounds of religion. On the other hand, it places Buddhism above the rest. Majoritarianism would have it that some citizens are more equal than others. For important decisions such as lawmaking or amending the Constitution, majority vote has become the more legitimizing factor over consent, consciousness, or collective preference. Take for instance the government's continued defense of 20th Amendment of the Constitution through the claim that the bill could be passed with two-thirds majority of Parliament. Despite the strong opposition by civil society groups, religious groups, councils, committees and organizations, the only justification has been the majority mandate and not welfare of all communities. It seems anything goes as long as has a majority on their side. The enactment of 20th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution deliberately reversed the democratic measures that assured transparency and accountability. Undemocratic reforms will be defended as demands of the majority declared through presidential and parliamentary elections, which saw a landslide victory for the governing party. Sri Lanka seems to be trapped in the fallacy of electoralism, the faith that elections alone accord public legitimacy to the winners, in this case to make sweeping and far-reaching change to the constitution, the very foundation of Sri Lanka's democracy. The idea that a constitution enshrined with safeguarding all communities equally can be amended or replaced purely with a majority mandate and with no consciousness by minorities it seeks to protect is illogical. It is also undemocratic, but it is not something new. This would not be the first time in Sri Lanka that democratic processes were used to legitimate undemocratic acts. Although elections are mandatory in representative democracy, in 1982, calling off the parliamentary election was legitimized by referendum held by former President J.R. Jayawardene. Essentially, people cast their vote against voting, and this was facilitated by President himself. Such blatant disregard for democratic values within Sri Lankan political leadership is rampant and unsurprising. The Sri Lankan political crisis in October 2018 saw the President's arbitrary removal of Prime Minister and dissolution of Parliament. Acts such as this, which manipulate democratic elements for political gain, must reflect an absence and weakness of commitment to democratic values among the leaders. Over the years, Sri Lanka has witnessed rise in the ethno-nationalist sentiment as well as the association of political leadership with Sinhala Buddhist leadership and dominance. Actions on the part of political leaders to appease this sentiment, such as rhetoric enforced by President Rajapaksa swearing in ceremony, fuel this majoritarian ethno-nationalist ideology that can have damaging impact on the sense of national belonging of minorities. In the worst case, as Sri Lanka has been unfortunate enough to witness, unchecked majoritarian sentiment could lead to tragic consequences such as social polarization and violence. The violence against Muslims in Oluthungma in 2014 and Diagna Kennedy in 2018, and even incidents as far as the Black July massacre in 1983 are examples of heightened ethno-nationalist sentiment coupled with inaction by governments to prevent majority aggression against minorities. Government's response to these incidents has shown that in Sri Lanka, protecting minorities has become a political inconvenience. Majority rule, then, while being an identifiable component of democracy, cannot be a lone guarantor of peaceful democratic governance. Rather, it can function as an element that breeds communal disharmony and eventually violence. In Sri Lanka, majority rule adopted in isolation with no regard for consent, consciousness and collective preference severely undermines both equality and quality of democracy. Sri Lanka is primary example of this majoritarianism only increases social polarization, leading to more chaos and violence than the country can afford. Now let's have a comparative assessment of Sri Lanka and Pakistan's democracy. In Colombo, President Rajapaksa made an overture to the opposition as armed troops were called out to quell more protests over the Sri Lanka's most severe economic crisis since independence in 1948. Police fired tear gas and water cannons to disperse thousands of protesters trying to storm the private home of Prime Minister, head of Rajapaksa's clan in the country south. The president asked the opposition parties to join the effort to seek the solution of national crisis after the resignation of nearly all cabinet members. The leftist People's Liberation Front responded by urging Rajapaksa to immediately step down. The main Tamil opposition party, Tamil National Alliance, too dismissed the idea of joining Rajapaksa's led administration. Additionally, the decline in the economic resilience has been caused mainly by populist economic policies and complacency by one and all, ignoring the worsening macroeconomic parameters. For instance, a vital fiscal deficit during normal growth times is ignored by justifying it as growth-inducing necessity. Such a fiscal deficit can be caused by either an increase in expenditure or by reducing taxes. And this is what the Rajapaksa government did in 2019. The newly elected Sri Lankan government in 2019 announced a series of populist tax cuts, reducing value-added tax by half and eliminating capital gain tax. The governance at the top was very unusual, to say the least. Four brothers became the president, the prime minister, minister for finance and agriculture, and the fifth minister for the sports was a nephew. How can one expect sound democratic governance in an atmosphere of nepotism like this? Dissent and disagreement are essential elements of democratic discourse, and when that is suppressed, one can be sure of decline. While Sri Lanka is in dire straits with food and forex shortage, countrywide unrest with entire cabinet resigning, and now dependence on aid from the donors like India, the situation in Pakistan is equally instructive. The historic ouster of Imran Khan's government was mainly the culmination of spendthrift policies, economic mismanagement, high inflation of 15% and unsustainable debt accumulation. While Khan has accused the opposition of colluding with US for regime change, basing the charge on a diplomatic cable sent by Pakistan's former ambassador to Washington following a meeting with senior US official. The US administration has rubbished the allegations. The popular mandate of Khan unfortunately led to populist policies. An opposition party member of the parliament, Nafisa Shah, accused Khan of having destroyed political culture, weakened parliament and institutions. In the perspective of peace, journalist Mavi Sirman warns that it would be foolish to conclude that democracy has prevailed in Pakistan, and Imran Khan's ouster is a proof of that. She asserts that it's mostly the army's doing, and it will take quite some time for political parties to become truly independent of army's influence. The fact remains that unlike neighboring India or also Bangladesh, Pakistan has suffered economic mismanagement, and the high inflation is but one manifestation of that. Excessive dependence on debt, whether from IMF or China, is also a factor. Well, dear students, in this lecture we discussed about democracy and types of democracy. We also discussed about conditions of democracy in Pakistan, and also discussed the situation of democracy in Sri Lanka. We also discussed the comparative analysis of Sri Lanka's and Pakistan's democracy. I hope you have enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.